Welcome everyone to Transforming a City, London, I gotta read it, London's Great Plague of 1665, the third presentation in the Humanities Center series, All Change Here, Pandemics and Transformation. Normally this would be hosted by Dr. Brian Clack, the A. Vasiliadis Director of the Humanities Center, but he's on sabbatical. And in his place, normally Dr. Caywood would be the host, but she's speaking today. So abnormally, this is David Hay, and I'm introducing people today. I guess in sync with All Change Here. In the way we'll proceed today, Dr. Caywood will speak first, and then Dr. Bird. And afterward, there'll be time for questions and hopefully your comments. Feel free to use the chat feature or raise your hand and come in later on in the talk when it's appropriate. Let me introduce Dr. Caywood first, the first speaker. She's a professor of English and affiliate professor of graduate theater, and she began her studies in English at the University of Kansas. She holds an MA from the University of Exeter in England and a PhD from Duke. She joined the English department at USD in 1984, where she has worked for 36 years, including 3 as department chair. In the English department, Dr. Caywood offers undergraduate courses on 17th and 18th century British literature, world drama, and women's literature. In 1987, when the university started its prestigious Shiley MFA actor training program with the Old Globe Theater, Dr. Caywood was one of the original faculty and has taught dramatic literature in that program during its 33 years. During her time at USD, she has won several awards for her teaching, including the Davies Chair in 1998. Along with the late Dr. Linda Perry in the Communication Studies Department, she co-founded USD's Women and Gender Studies program and co-founded the London Summer Program in 2003 with me. She is serving as the temporary director of the Humanities Center while the director, Dr. Brian Clack, is on sabbatical. Her research interests include 17th century woman playwright Aphra Behn, novelist Jane Austen, and the late American playwright August Wilson, with special interests in British and American theater history, stage production, and feminist theory. Her current writing project is a book that focuses on a day in the life of a restoration theater. She has also served as a dramaturg on restoration and 18th century theater productions, and she was commissioned to adapt Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol for Center Repertory Company in Walnut Creek, where it has been staged annually for over 20 years. Dr. Caywood's talk this afternoon is entitled Journals of a Plague Year, Samuel Pepys, Daniel Defoe, and the Great London Plague of 1665. Dr. Caywood?
On Sunday, April 13th, 1665, Londoner Samuel Pepys includes an ominous entry in his famous diary, quote, "Great fears of the sickness here in the city, it being said that 2 or 3 houses are already shut up. God preserve us all." The sickness was the much feared bubonic plague, and when it finally faded, nearly 18 months later, over 100,000 Londoners, nearly 25% of the city's population, were dead. The Great Plague that struck London in 1665 was nothing new. London, like most European capitals, had been devastated when the medieval outbreak of bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing, historians estimate, between 40 and 60% of the population. London itself had seen a number of outbreaks prior to Pepys's experience. Between 1603 and 1613, when Shakespeare was writing some of his greatest plays, plagues shut his and other London playhouses for months on end. 30,000 Londoners died from an outbreak in 1625 and another 10,000 11 years later. The living conditions in much of London created ideal nesting spaces for the black rats that were infested with the fleas carrying the disease-causing bacterium. Most houses were built out of wood, wattle, and daub, a composite material made from clay, straw, and animal dung. The upper stories overhung the bottom ones, which created more room in the house without increasing ground rents, but it meant that houses were only a few feet from those across the way, making the narrow streets dark and fetid. Runnels ran down the middle of streets, serving as open sewers. London was virtually a petri dish for promoting disease. The infection, thought to have come from the Netherlands in bolts of cloth, broke out first on the western side of London in an impoverished area near present-day Covent Garden. Over the next few weeks, it spread slowly and methodically from west to east, parish by parish. Those who could, including doctors, merchants, clergy, and lawyers, fled. The king and his court decamped first to Hampton Court, some 20 miles outside London, then to Oxford. City magistrates issued decree after decree to try and suppress those who were infected, but they were hampered by independent liberties and suburbs that often set forth separate policies. If someone in a house became infected, both the healthy and the sick were shut in the house for 40 days. Its door marked with a red X and guarded by a watchman, lest the inhabitants try to flee. Dogs and cats were killed, as they were thought to be carriers of the disease. Parishes were tasked with making weekly counts of the dead, issuing what came to be known as the Mortality Bills, and believed by most, then and now, to be highly inaccurate. When the numbers of those dying became too numerous for other parishes to bury, carts rumbled nightly through the streets, collecting corpses, which were then carried and dumped in massive burial pits. The air was thick with choking smoke from many fires lit throughout the city, as smoke was thought to be a prophylactic against the disease. Samuel Pepys was in many ways an ideal spectator for this macabre spectacle. 32, when the plague erupted, he had become a man of considerable influence. 5 years prior, he had been included in an escort that brought back the newly restored Charles II to England. And by 1665, his intelligence, hard work, affability, and administrative talent meant that he had risen to a position of considerable responsibility as a civilian manager in the Royal Navy. He was beginning to acquire both stature and wealth, and the diary is dotted with lovely anecdotes about how his slow accretion of all the markers of Restoration success, an expensive wig, fashionable suits of the finest fabrics, portraits of him and his young wife, Elizabeth. His responsibilities at the Admiralty forced Pepys to remain in London, and as he made his daily rounds, he saw firsthand how the dreaded disease was transforming the city. In early June, for example, Pepys' work brings him to Drury Lanes, one of the worst infected areas where, quote, "Against my will, I did see 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors, and Lord have mercy upon us writ there, which was a sad sight to me, being the first of the kind that, to my remembrance, I ever saw." A few days later, he learns the plague has spread to the city, which refers to that part of London within the city walls, and had infected Fenchurch Street, where his good friend and personal physician, Dr. Burnett, lived. Pepys is so distressed that he takes to his bed with a crippling headache and resolves to put his affairs in order and write a will, lest it should, quote, "please God to take me away." On June 21st, Pepys witnesses the mass exodus from the city, remarking that, quote, "I find all the town almost going out of town, the coaches and wagons being all full of people going into the country." On June 28th, he spots several plague houses near Whitehall, the King's Palace, and it spurs him to move his wife and household downriver to rented lodgings in the less infected suburb of Woolwich. When he's summoned to the king, sheltering 20 miles away at Hampton Court, he is deeply troubled by the experience. Quote, "It is, I perceive, an unpleasing thing to be at court. everybody fearful of one another and all so sad, inquiring after the plague, so that after a bit I stole away by horse. By the 18th of July, Pepys is troubled to hear that the large number of corpses has necessitated opening up a burial pit at Top Hill Fields near modern-day Victoria Station. Curiosity about the pits overcomes him a few weeks later, and he can't resist visiting another site. Quote, I went forth and walked towards more fields to see, God forbid my presumption, whether I could see any dead corpse going into the grave, but as God would have it, I did not. He remarks frequently on the transformed streets, eerily empty, with no crowds in familiar shopping areas and parks. He tries to convince his cousin's husband to leave for the Pepys family village 50 miles away, but her husband refuses, fearing that his business will fail if the pair of them are not there to keep it open and tend to it, and Pepys leaves, sadly fearing that he will never see them alive again. The sight of the ill collapsing in the street or of corpses left unattended where they died fills Pepys with horror. Quote, the disease is making us more cruel to one another than if we were dogs. On a trip into the city in late August, he remarked that the people he passed were, quote, walking like people that had taken leave of the world. Pepys finally proposes moving himself and the Admiralty office downriver to Greenwich, and by mid-August, with the disease raging in the city, Pepys receives orders to do so. Yet in midst of this hard, grim reality, Pepys resolutely pursued the usual rounds of dinner parties and social visits that always brought him such pleasure, in part because he believed, as did others, that good spirits could help give him immunity against the disease. A few days after learning of Dr. Burnett's fate, Pepys walks to Fenchurch Street to check on his physician, but just as importantly, to show off to his friends his new, quote, black silk Camelot suit. That same evening, several friends visit him, and they, quote, played and sung and supped, most excellent, pretty company, so pleasant, ingenious, and harmless, I cannot desire better. He frequently visits the eminent antiquarian John Evelyn and admires his gardens and library, and listens to his plays and poetry, confiding to his diary that Evelyn's compositions are, quote, very good, but not as good as he believes them to be. He and his wife have a merry party to celebrate their 10th anniversary in September of 1665, and he is enlisted in the planning and execution of a major society wedding. Making his will necessitates putting his house and finances in order, and Pepys revels in learning how wealthy he has become during the pandemic year. He even manages to sneak in visits to his mistress, a Mrs. Bagwell, his Valentine, as he calls her, with little regard for the danger. Quote, round about and next door on every side is the plague, but I did not value it, but there did what I could with her. Most remarkably, when the death figures were at their worst, he exclaims that, quote, everything else hath conspired to my happiness and pleasure more for these last 3 months than in all my life before, in so little time. I have never lived so merrily, besides that I never go so much as I have done this plague time. Some 55 years later, Daniel Defoe, best known for writing Robinson Crusoe, took up the 1665 outbreak as the subject for one of the most innovative and harrowing of 18th century novels, A Journal of the Plague Year. Defoe, who had been 5 years old when the Great Plague had struck London, was concerned about a massive outbreak of the disease that had hit the French port of Marseille in 1720, spread across Provence, and left 100,000 dead in its wake. Robert Walpole's Whig government began to prepare for the disease to visit British shores and passed the so-named Quarantine Act that included several draconian measures. The government mandated that once again the sick were to be locked up with the well for 40 days, but also ordered that anyone defying the quarantine would be put to death. Local authorities were allowed to use any kind of violence to enforce the act, including the right to dig trenches around infected areas and shoot anyone who attempted to cross them. Not surprisingly, the act was roundly condemned by the opposition, and Walpole's government needed to generate support for it. Enter Defoe. In addition to being a journalist, novelist, and owner of a small tile factory, Defoe was also a Whig propagandist. Thus, in part, he undertook the writing of Plague Year to support the government's policies. He hoped to warn the British about the miseries another plague could bring and encourage them to support measures that could contain a possible outbreak. But as a champion of individual rights and a small business owner himself, Defoe was deeply troubled by how severe many of those policies were. Thus, the novel becomes a kind of dialectic, as its narrator, a saddle maker known only to us as H.F., spends much of his narrative debating various spiritual, philosophical, political, and personal issues prompted by his experience. Was he following God's divine providence by remaining in London instead of fleeing? Or was he acting hubristically, believing that he was one of God's chosen ones and would survive? Was quarantining people the best way to contain the spread? Or was the practice, nearly impossible to enforce, and a probable death sentence for everyone shut up in the household, far more destructive than beneficial? Did paying the poor to serve as constables and nurses for the ill provide them with much needed income in a crippled economy? Or did the practice consign them to certain death? This continual debate both affirms and interrogates Whig policies. Defoe manages to balance the demands of his responsibilities as a paid propagandist with those of a journalist and novelist guided by artistic truth. This delicate balance prompted a recent Washington Post editorial to call him the Dr. Fauci of his age. The writer goes on to assert that Defoe's novel ends up as that, quote, rarest of birds, a work of immediate political propaganda that is also a work of lasting literary importance. Journal also establishes many of the tropes associated with plague literature and film. In many plague narratives, characters are tormented by the inescapability of their predicament, and HF is increasingly enveloped by the progress of the disease through the city. He tries to protect himself by various preventatives, like keeping a fire going, avoiding crowds, or washing his money in vinegar. But curiosity overcomes common sense, and he wanders the city by day and by night, bearing witness to the cruel practices of quarantine and the callous treatment of the sick and the dying. He is appalled by each evening's ritual of plague carts rumbling through the city, calling for citizens to bring out their dead. And he is sickened by the sight of the corpses being unceremoniously dumped into the burial pits. Though remaining physically healthy, he cannot escape the psychological trauma of what he's witnessing and comes to question God's providential will and mercy. Another recurring trope is that the disease comes from somewhere else, often a distant, often hostile country. In Journal, HF opens by telling us of the initial rumors about the plague. Quote, "It was about the beginning of September 1664 that I heard the plague was returned again in Holland, for it had been very violent there in 1663. It was brought, some said, from Italy, others from the Levant, which was the Middle East, among some goods which were brought home by a Turkish fleet. Others said it was brought from Candia or Cyprus. It mattered not from whence it came, but all agreed it was come into Holland again." At the time of the 1665 plague, Britain was at war with Holland. It's no surprising then that blame was placed on British enemies, and the fear of plague became one more way of inflaming anti-Dutch fury. Moreover, it had come to Holland, as HF recounts, via a Catholic country or via the Middle East, rousing fears of and capitalizing on both the anti-Catholic and anti-Muslim sentiments deeply woven into the fabric of early 18th century English life. Another plague trope is that an outbreak of plague often brings about political transformation, reversals, and social collapse. Government and religious authority fail, social institutions deteriorate, medical, religious, public health, and legal institutions are unable to effect control. In Plague Year, the king and his court have abandoned the city, leaving only the city magistrates in charge. Many of the city's best doctors have fled, leaving people at the mercy of quacks and astrologers. Many priests of the Church of England have also bolted, leaving Londoners either without spiritual comfort or turning to dissenting clergy for solace. Looting becomes common, a crime H.F. claims done primarily by women. Civility disappears. H.F. recounts visiting a favorite tavern on the route of the death carts, which were often followed by mourners. He witnesses a group of hooligans sitting by the tavern windows each night, mocking the mourners, urging them to jump into the pits, and threatening anyone, including H.F., who tries to stop them. What distinguishes Defoe's narrative from many preceding plague stories is the attention Defoe gives to those who are suffering the most from the plague, London's poor and working class. Pepys is somewhat indifferent to this tragedy. The plight of the poor disappears into Pepys' concern with his own welfare. A hackney coach driver suddenly falls ill while driving Pepys through the city, and he leaps out, fearing for his life. He has household servants who become sick, and he becomes concerned with packing them up and getting them out of the house, lest they infect the family or force his household into quarantine. By contrast, H.F. dwells upon the fate of those too poor to control their miserable situations. His story offers dozens of affecting narratives about the terrible cost of the disease, the exploitation by hucksters of those desperate for a cure, and the great emotional suffering of those who survive the loss of children, spouses, and friends. In a particularly heart-wrenching moment, H.F. recounts seeing a man following the death cart that carries the corpses of every person in his family. The man mourned heartily, Defoe writes, or H.F. says, but with a kind of masculine grief that could not give itself vent by tears. Calmly desiring the carriers to let him alone, he said he would only see the bodies thrown in. But no sooner was the cart turned around and the bodies shot into the pit promiscuously, which came as a surprise to him, for he expected that they would have been decently laid in. Then he cried aloud, unable to contain himself, went backward 2 or 3 steps, and fell down in a swoon. In a journal, people normally invisible in period literature become the subjects of their story, not objects. Their painful sufferings are movingly documented, and the powerful who flee, whom H.F. argues continuously had a higher duty to care for those less fortunate, are roundly and bitterly excoriated. The plague lingered on for months, with surges that came and went. Both Pepys and H.F. rejoice when the numbers fall and worry when they rise. As the peaks flatten, the city slowly returns to normalcy. H.F. recounts that after a bit of fervent prayer and thanksgiving, people cynically returned to their old self-involved patterns. But as the plague died down, another great curse descended upon the city, the Great Fire of London, which broke out in September of 1666, destroyed most of the city of London, that square mile within the city walls, including the medieval St. Paul's. Charles II and his government put forward a rebuilding act, and the character of London underwent considerable transformation. Streets were widened and open sewers were abolished. Houses had to be built of less flammable materials like brick and stone. The built-out profiles of medieval and Elizabethan houses were prohibited. Intended primarily as fire prevention, the measures also resulted in a healthier city, as the rebuilding program eliminated many of the kinds of spaces where the black rat thrived. Largely due to these reformations, London never again had as massive an outbreak of bubonic plague in the years following this great outbreak. As I worked on this talk, I was repeatedly struck by how so much was now familiar to me. Fear of the disease was coupled with denial. Government misinformation and the disparities restrictions from London's suburb to suburb, or in our case, from state to state, from city to city, have fostered the disease's spread. There was a sickening gap between how the epidemic affected the rich and the poor, the same as we have experienced. Citizens struggle with lockdowns and preventative measures, and while many try to be cautious, others are dismayed by the willful indifference of some to them. Londoners struggled to find a balance between containing the disease and saving the economy, as we have done. When the COVID panic began, I said to Brian, if anyone wants to know how this will go, she should read Pepys or Defoe. Given the severity of our own COVID pandemic and the repetition of the mistakes of 1665, that recommendation stands now woefully true. Through our ignorance, our willful ignorance, we have been condemned to repeat our collective history. Thank you.
Thanks. I look forward to the comments later on. But let me go ahead and introduce science. Well, arts speaks to science. Dr. Terry Bird, Associate Professor of Biology, earned both his Bachelor of Science and his PhD in microbiology from the University of British Columbia. He joined the USD faculty in the Department of Biology in 2005, and his primary teaching responsibilities include undergraduate lecture and laboratory courses in genetics and microbiology. His research is centered on examining the regulation of developmental processes and global control of gene expression in bacteria. He has also conducted cancer research within the Laboratory of Cellular Oncology at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Bird's research at USD comprises significant student involvement. Most recently, his lab employed a genetic approach to identify genes required for encystment, which is the process of becoming enclosed by a cyst in the purple photosynthetic bacteria Rhodospirillum centenum, which we all know of. Dr. Bird has co-authored several research and review articles which have appeared in various journals, including Molecular Biology, Journal of Molecular Biology, and Cell. Dr. Bird is the departmental coordinator for courses in genetics. His teaching responsibilities include a lecture and laboratory course in microbiology, a first-year biology lecture and lab course called Genomes and Evolution, which he describes as great fun, and a very timely biology class entitled Peoples, Plagues, and Microbes. He taught an early version of this course during the London summer program, where he and Dr. Caywood were pleased to discover a mutual fascination with London's Great Plague. Dr. Bird's talk this afternoon is entitled Spillover, the Making of the Plague Pathogen. Dr. Bird?
Thank you, David. And thank you to Cindy. That was a great talk, and I think complements what I want to talk about today. I think Cindy did a great job of talking about the impact of the plague on London. I want to talk a little bit more, since I'm a microbiologist interested in bacteria, I want to talk about the transformation of the pathogen that caused the plague in the first place. Just very quickly, to get some statistics out of the way, you heard from Cindy already that this was the plague we're talking about that occurred in 1665 was the last great outbreak of plague to occur in England. It's recorded to have killed at least 70,000 people, but most likely killed as many as 100,000 people, which was 20 to 25% of the population. Interestingly, Cindy showed the bill of mortality that was recorded weekly. And this is the bill, I think it's the same one that she showed in her presentation. That is from a week in September of 1665, when the plague was at its height in London. And there's a couple of things to point out. It's debatable how accurate these were, but there is some information that's worth noting in here. If you look down at the bottom, the number of parishes infected, 126. Only 4 plagues in London were unaffected by the plague during the middle of the pandemic. And of the 8,297 burials, the vast majority of those were due to people dying of the plague. One of the utilities of the mortality bill was to spot the onset of epidemics quickly. So when numbers of people were seen to be dying from the same sorts of things, authorities could begin to realize that an epidemic was beginning, and then hopefully take steps to contain it. These data here, this comes from a graph, and I'm not sure how accurate it is, but I believe the graph plots the numbers of deaths from these mortality bills throughout the year of 1665. And what's apparent is that the vast majority of the plague deaths occurred during a very short wave. And it's interesting, you know, we're all hearing about waves now, waves of the COVID-19 pandemic that are washing around the world, while people were experiencing waves in the pandemic that happened hundreds of years ago as well. There's two interesting notes, I think, to make of this graph. First off, this is a very high peak that is killing tens of thousands of people per week at its height. So clearly the pathogen that's causing this is very virulent. And I think the other thing that's interesting to note from this is that this wave is relatively short. The wave, the major part of the pandemic occurred over a period of 4 to 5 months, which suggests that this pathogen is not only virulent, but it's extremely infectious and is able to jump from host to host quickly. And those really are the hallmarks of deadly pandemics, the ability to infect large number of hosts over a short period of time, and of course the virulence. If it's a deadly pandemic, the virulence that enables this pathogen to kill its hosts or victims. There's actually 3 different pandemics that have been attributed to the plague, the bubonic plague. The first of these, the plague of Justinian, that occurred in the 5th to 7th centuries. The Black Death, which is what we're talking about now. And it might interest you to note that the Great Plague of London was really the end of a 300-year pandemic that included that initial wave through Europe in 1347. It's kind of sobering to realize that we're getting a little tired of this current pandemic, but obviously nowhere near the 300 years that the pandemic rolled throughout Europe, Asia, and North Africa. And then there was a third pandemic, the modern plague, which began in China towards the end of the middle of the 19th century, reached a peak towards the end of the 19th century, and then actually spread across from Asia into North America around the turn of the 20th century. At the time, at least for the first 2 pandemics, nobody had a good idea of what was causing these epidemics. There were various people who suggested this was the wrath of God that was meant to be a punishment. Others believed in a prevailing theory at the time that miasma, bad odors, were causing these tremendous pandemics that were killing millions of people. But of course, as you've heard and you probably are aware, the real story was more complex than that. As Cindy indicated, bubonic plague is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This is a single-cell bacteria that is about 1/1,000,000th of a meter long, so incredibly small organism that requires a light microscope to be able to see. She indicated that this bacterium is transported by a number of other organisms, most notably the flea. A flea, a blood feeding organism that can feed off different hosts, including rodents and obviously people. All of these combine together through interactions that enable this bacterium to be infectious and to be able to get to its ultimate host and cause pandemics in a human population. There are 3 forms of the bubonic plague that are worth noting. The bubonic plague, as we normally hear, this is caused by a bacterium that generally infects a person through a flea bite. The bacterium makes its way to lymph nodes, which are part of the immune system. These lymph nodes, when they become infected, begin to swell, they begin to bleed, so they become large buboes, large swellings that are black because of the blood in them. And typically, if this form of the plague is untreated, it has a mortality rate of about 50%. Pneumonic plague is a very virulent form of the plague, and this can occur when a person's lungs become infected and heavily damaged by the bacterium. Damaged lungs are going to cause sneezing and coughing, which is going to spew droplets, aerosols of mucus and saliva that carry the bacterium and can carry that bacterium into another person. So Pneumonic plague doesn't require the fleas to transfer the bacterium. In this case, the bacterium can find new human hosts simply through aerosol. And you can see the mortality rate significantly higher, up about 90%. Both bubonic plague and pneumonic plague can transform into septicemic plague, which is when the bacteria infects the vascular system of people. This carries the bacteria throughout the body. Organ failure follows from after being heavily damaged, and invariably without medical attention, this is 100% fatal. So what I want to do now is transition into talking about how did Yersinia pestis acquire the ability to be such an infectious, virulent pathogen that was capable of forming pandemics. And this includes finding the evidence to show that the previous plagues, before the modern plague, the Justinian Black Plagues, were actually caused by bubonic plague. Up until a couple of decades ago, we really just relied on the chroniclers of the time who described the disease and described symptoms that were seen very similar to the bubonic plague, the enlargement of the lymph nodes that I was describing a little before, the bleeding from the lungs, as I described before. A couple of decades ago, or about a decade ago, it became possible to extract DNA from ancient skeletons, including skeletons that go back 1,500 years ago to the time of the Justinian plague. Within the skeletons, there are teeth. The teeth protect DNA from microbial degradation, and even though these bodies have been in the soil for hundreds or perhaps 1,000 or more years. And biologists have acquired the ability to extract this DNA and sequence it. And we now have been able to confirm that Yersinia pestis DNA has been extracted from the teeth from skeletons known to belong to victims that have died from the bubonic plague during the Justinian and Black Plagues. Now, what was interesting when this work was reported was that the genetic makeup of Yersinia pestis was incredibly similar to another bacterium that was fairly well known, Yersinia pseudotuberculosis. These bacteria are close enough, it's probably better to call them siblings rather than cousins. Yersinia pseudotuberculosis is a bacterium that was known to circulate in the bloodstreams of rodents, particularly burrowing rodents. It's also been known to sicken humans, although generally it causes very mild symptoms. Why pseudotuberculosis generally infects people who eat contaminated food or drink contaminated water. It causes mild indigestion, maybe a little bit of diarrhea, and sometimes people don't even notice the symptoms, don't even realize that they were sick. The DNA evidence suggests that less than 10,000 years ago, Yersinia pestis evolved from a very mild pathogen like pseudotuberculosis into the deadly pathogen that has been capable of causing the pandemics. So we talked about extracting DNA from skeletons that go back 1,500 years. We've now been able to push that back to up to 5,000 years ago. Researchers have extracted Yersinia pestis DNA from skeletons of people that lived during the Bronze Age. And we found that in many cases, these people were infected with Yersinia pestis, but not the same strain as Yersinia pestis that caused later pandemics. This was a much more mild form that couldn't use fleas as a vector and lacked some other abilities of causing deep tissue damage. And so these strains that sickened people 5,000 years ago appeared to be a new player, something that evolved from an early ancestor like pseudotuberculosis and is now beginning to evolve into a human pathogen and will later begin to acquire the traits that allow it to cause pandemics. So I want to concentrate first on changes that allowed it, Yersinia pestis, to become a pathogen that was able to use fleas as vectors. You're probably aware that fleas take blood meals. That's how they get their nourishment. They bite their host, engorge themselves of blood, and then they can digest the blood to get any nourishment. Now, obviously, if there are any bacteria in the blood of the host, those bacteria would be taken up by the blood meal and are easily transferred to the vector. And so on its surface, fleas represent a tremendous opportunity to become more infectious and allow the bacteria to get from host to host. But there were a number of problems that Yersinia pestis had to overcome while it was evolving into a deadly pathogen. First, Yersinia pestis had to stop killing fleas. Interestingly, Y pseudotuberculosis, although it causes mild disease or maybe no disease in mammals, is deadly to fleas. And so one of the first things that occurred in the journey, the evolutionary journey that Y pestis took, was a mutation that actually caused a loss of genetic information. It prevented Y pestis from producing a toxin in the gut of the flea. That prevented the bacteria from killing the flea. Now the bacterium can begin to use the flea as a vector to move from host to host. But it required more changes before the flea could serve as an effective vector. One of those was a change that allowed the bacterium Y pestis and pseudotuberculosis generally infect the hindgut of a flea, which allowed the bacteria to be shed from the flea in feces. But as you'll see in a moment, the flea could be converted to a much better vector. Once the bacteria was able to mutate, it actually gained genetic information that allowed the bacteria to now colonize the foregut, and then followed by a second loss of genetic information that allowed this bacteria to grow as a biofilm on a valve, a special valve called the proventriculus that joins the esophagus to the stomach of the flea. A biofilm is a thick coating of bacteria that is living attached to a solid surface. And in this case, this special valve, the proventriculus, plays an important role because it allows a flea to take a blood meal from one host. It allows then, before that first blood meal is digested, to take a second blood meal without regurgitating the first. So this is essentially a one-way valve that lets things into the stomach, but prevents regurgitation from the stomach back into the host. To turn the flea into an efficient vector, Y pestis learned to grow a biofilm on this one-way valve, destroying its function. So that every time a flea takes a bite, it regurgitates a bit of its previous meal, including any bacteria that was in that previous meal, into the new host. So the flea has facilitated a spillover. There's a term that we're all becoming familiar with now with the current pandemic. The spillover of bubonic plague from rodents into the human population was made possible by the flea. The flea is now able to transport bacteria from individual rodents to individual rodents, and even from one rodent species to another, amplifying the number of hosts, and in many cases more likely that the bacterium is going to come into contact with another mammal, humans. The flea, when it's unable to find its normal rodent host, is not adverse to biting a human to get a blood meal, and is now serving as a vector to be able to transport the bacterium from a rodent into a person. But although this was a leap forward in the evolution of the pathogen, it required yet another mutation to be able to efficiently allow transmission of the pathogen from person to person, which would cause this very rapid pandemic that we saw, or epidemic that we saw break out in the Great Plague of London. Yersinia pestis acquired the ability to dissolve blood clots. It produces an enzyme, a new gene called PLA, allows the bacteria to produce an enzyme that breaks down blood clots. Blood clots are a way that bodies use to try and contain, obviously, bleeding, but also to contain pathogens, keep them localized until they can be dealt with. For a pathogen, that's not a good thing. You want to be able to break out of the clot so you can grow your population and avoid the immune system. The ability to dissolve blood clots meant that the bacterium could now get into the lungs of a person, damage the lungs of a person, and cause pneumonic plague. This is some images taken from badly infected lymph nodes, taken from a mouse model. And it shows, I'll just direct your attention to this one panel here. It shows a close-up of this lymph node here within the blood stream. This is a blood vessel, a cross-section of a blood vessel. You can see tiny bacteria that are able to get in there because they are able to break blood clots and allow it to spread throughout the body, and then again, including the lungs. Again, this was a great leap forward for the bacterium, because now the flea could be used as a vector to move from the rodent population into the human population, and more devastatingly, to be able to infect the lungs of individuals, allowing for transmission through airborne aerosols from person to person. So now not only is human-to-human transmission possible, pandemics, devastating pandemics have been enabled. This is a phylogenetic tree that shows the accumulation of some of the genetic mutations that I've just been talking about. Phylogenetic trees are looking at family trees of ancestry. Over here on the left, a little over 5,000 years ago, we have an early ancestor of Yersinia pestis that looks much like Y. pseudotuberculosis. These steps that I've circled here are mutations or gain of genes that have occurred at different times during the development, leading to diversification of this lineage of bacterium into relatively, well, perhaps deadly, but not very infectious strains of bacteria that were infecting people of the Bronze Age. But eventually gaining the ability to use a flea for transmission, and here down here, acquiring the PLA gene and then sort of modifying the PLA gene to be able to cause pneumonic plague. This last mutation has often been called the Big Bang event that converted a relatively innocuous pathogen into a deadly pathogen capable of causing pandemics. And then, of course, you can see this occurred about 3,000 years ago. The plague of Justinian, the Black Death we're currently talking about, and the modern plague that broke out later, all happened later after the bacterium had acquired the ability to cause pneumonic plague. Once all those mutations were in place, the Black Death that we currently refer to was ready to take shape. It is generally thought that a Mongol army in the 14th century delivered the bacterium to the doorstep of Europe. It was dispersed initially through Genoese sailors who fled the conflict in that area, brought the bacterium, the fleas, possibly the rats, to Europe. And then it took a few years, about 7 to 8 years, for the initial wave of the pandemic to sweep throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Generally accepted to have killed a third of the European population during this first wave. But then, although it died down for a period after that, periodic outbreaks, devastating outbreaks, would pop up throughout Europe at various times, perhaps 10 to 20 years apart. There are various hypotheses to explain how this might have occurred. If there's time with the questions, if you're interested, we can talk a little bit about it. I wanted to come back to this image. Cindy showed this image as well. This is an image that depicts London during the Great Plague. It was quite common, as she pointed out, to be lighting bonfires throughout the city. And the reason for this was, again, the belief in miasma, the idea that bad odors, and as Cindy described, this was not a very sanitary city. There were a lot of bad odors around. This was an attempt to purify the air by causing these large bonfires, but probably made things worse by increasing the smoke and debris in the air. So I hope I've given you a little bit of a taste of how this pandemic that transformed not only a city, but an entire country or continent that affected socioeconomic structures, religion, certainly medical practice, persecution of various people, and affected the art of the world. All of these were caused, again, by a bacterium that is about 1/1,000,000th of a meter long, that has evolved within the last 5,000 years to acquire these special traits that allow it to be a deadly pathogen. And I'll end my talk there, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to have some questions and answers.
And we'll just take questions now. I have one, a couple actually for Terry. I was absolutely riveted by that. And of course, one can't help assuming many of the same kind of evolutionary paths have been followed by the COVID virus that is afflicting us now. And I'm sure a lot of research will go into tracing that evolutionary history over the next decades. But one of the things that Defoe writes about often is a person who would be fine walking down the street, having breakfast, and then suddenly, with no symptoms whatsoever, drop dead. And it accounted in part for the number of corpses that were to be found in alleyways or in the bypaths of London. What version of the bubonic plague was that?
That was probably pneumonic plague. Pneumonic plague is incredibly fast. I've heard as little as 24 hours to go from feeling the first symptoms to being dead. And, you know, at that time when you're feeling symptoms, nowadays you feel some symptoms, you think, oh, it'll pass, take an aspirin and be fine. In those days, who knew what those symptoms meant? And I suspect there could be a little bit of denial. That you just didn't want to accept that what you're feeling that coughing or what have you that might start with pneumonic plague. And so you might want to fight through it and just go on and do your daily chores. But pneumonic plague, not only very deadly, but very, very rapid.
I had another question, if I can find it here on my, when you were showing the picture of the charcoal fires in London, and it was one of a number of preventatives, which I think when you look at them kind of approximate things that we try to do, like disinfecting coins with vinegar and that sort of thing. But did the smoke help promote bacteria in the aerosol coming out of people's lungs?
I don't think so. I suspect that the aerosol coming out of the lungs that would carry the bacteria were large droplets that probably didn't go very far and fell quickly. So I doubt that it had much of an effect on that. It is interesting, though, that it was a very common thing to do to light these large bonfires, again, to purify the air. One of my favorite stories is the Pope, and maybe somebody there knows who was Pope in 1346 or 47. He famously plunked himself down in a chair between two large bonfires and would only let people in to stoke the bonfires. But he was so convinced that that would protect him that was his, and it worked apparently. Well, at least he survived. And so this was a pretty common strategy at the time. It was so ingrained in people that bad odors were the cause of disease. Mm-hmm. And you know, it may seem silly now, but if you think about it, eating food that smells bad probably makes you sick. And so I think there was some evidence, at least on their part, to suggest the idea that bad odors could lead to illness and lead to these sorts of things. Florence has got her hand up.
Yeah, Florence.
I have to apologize first for joining late. I couldn't come in until late. But Terry, I wanted to ask you, how do archaeologists deal with the presence of bacterium still in ancient skeletons? Like,
it's a great question. There's been a tremendous leap in technology over the last couple of decades. You're probably all aware the human genome was sequenced 20 years ago, in part because of tremendous advances in DNA extraction technology, how you extract the DNA out of ancient bones or fossils, as well as how you sequence the DNA. And so there's a lot of microbial activity in soil. And so much of the DNA of a person or any microbes that they were carrying would be quickly degraded by those microbes, except in the teeth. Biologists have realized in the teeth there's dental pulp that is protected from the elements and from these contaminating microbes. And so if you take the teeth out of the skull, you can drill into them aseptically and acquire the contents in there. and be able to sort out, another advance is to be able to sort out the bacterial DNA from the human DNA so that you can sequence it and figure out what sort of microbes may or may not have been present there.
I was wondering, Terry, too, if you could talk a little bit about the excavations that are going on in London right now because of the new subway line that's being built, that it's going through places like Moorfields where there are massive burial pits.
Yeah, I haven't been following it that closely, but I can say, we're actually reading right now in the People's Plagues and Microbes class that I'm reading. This book deals with a plague of cholera that happened about 150 years ago. And the author makes the point there that people building in London made an effort to try and avoid these pits, these plague pits. Again, because of miasma, the idea that if you disturb these pits, you're going to stir up miasma and cause new plagues to occur. But it happens in London all the time, new buildings going up or subways being put in where they come across these pits. I think at the Tesco's you and I used to shop in at Miles End was actually built over a plague pit. And so they are all over the city. I haven't been following that particular example there.
Yeah, David? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah. I wonder, maybe I missed it, Cindy, but do either Defoe or Pepys talk about deniers and people who refuse to accept evidence or that kind of thing as it's going on now?
Yeah, I think it's particularly clear in Defoe because, you know, Pepys is sort of reacting in the moment. And he's also not, I think, as fully immersed in the experience of the plague as Defoe's narrator is. But certainly it's a characteristic of people that he encounters who are doing behaviors or engaging in behaviors that he finds not only foolish, but dangerous. And the story of the men who would sit in the pub and jeer at Defoe's narrator, H.F., is you know, somewhat grimly delighted when, because of their refusal to take precautions or stay away from those events, they themselves end up with the plague, and he watches and witnesses their bodies being dumped into the burial pit. Whereas other people were extremely careful. He narrates another story, tells another story about a man who isolates himself on a small ship and sets up a pulley and rope system so that his family on the shore can send over bread and drink and cheese until he's gotten through the 40 days of quarantine. So you see the same kinds of behavior that we're seeing and often exclaiming over today in terms of how people respond to, you know, a situation like this. Are there any other questions or comments? Yeah, Mary?
Cindy, thank you very much for your talk, and thank you, Terry. It's really interesting. I guess maybe it's speculative, Cindy, because you did such a fine job of making the connections between this 18th century, 17th, 18th century experiences and the contemporary one. If Defoe and Pepys joined our Zoom call here, what would they say to us?
Well, I think Pepys would probably advise us to be cautious, but to take joy in the fact that the stock market's healthy and that perhaps we'll all emerge wealthier from this, depending on what the size of our investments are, wealthier from this period than we went into it. I think Defoe would be on the front lines, really. I think he would be very aware of the ways in which the government has failed us. He'd be very aware of the, especially the racial gap between, in our country, between those who are most affected by the plague. But I think whatever front line Defoe found himself on, like Dr. Fauci, he would find a way to condemn without condemning, to bring attention without forfeiting his ability to speak. I think he, had a great capacity for negotiating tight spaces. But I think we'd all be relieved in some ways to have another voice like Fauci's speaking for the complexities of what's happening and advocating for common sense sort of responses to the event. I do have another question in our chat space from Mike Kelly. And the question is, given the social disparities and ills you so nicely presented in documenting Pepys and Defoe, and given that Camus in his plague speaks the social plague metaphorically, was there any such metaphorical discussion of social plagues as we have heard so frequently in our time? And I think perhaps that's a question for others besides me. I know that Fred, for example, has been reading Camus. I think I can speak about a fairly contemporary treatment of the AIDS plague, the AIDS pandemic, Tony Kushner's Angels in America, which is both a sort of dystopian autobiography of, I think, a gay man's attempt to negotiate life in a world that is hostile to his very being and a government that denies him. And so I think that even though it's a very moving story of a particular group of people, it also functions as a metaphorical expose of the dangers of conservative policy towards those who live on the borders of a society, and the way that that is not only dangerous, but death dealing. So I think I would say that's a wonderful example of a metaphorical treatment of a plague. Again, if you don't know the play, it's Tony Kushner, Angels in America, just a spectacular contemporary text. Herb?
Yeah, a couple of points. First, the Pope to whom you were referring was probably Clement VI, who we all think of the Pope as being in Rome, but during that period of time, it was what was referred to as the Babylonian captivity. The Pope was actually located in Avignon, right. And the Pope was French at the time. I'm reminded by your literary relation of the introduction in Boccaccio's Decameron, where, if I remember correctly, he basically comments on the medical care, and he basically says that at the outset the medical care was pretty good, but then all of the people who had medical training got the plague and died, and they were replaced by people who really didn't know anything about medicine because they were the only people who were available.
Right. So you're right. So a lot of them disappeared when they could. That was the best way to survive the plague, was to get out of town. But then a number of them died. Most of the texts that I read said that physicians, the kind of cures and treatments that they relied on were ancient, some of them going back as far as Aristotle, and had little to no effect. Some of them would appear to work on some people, but then the same treatment wouldn't work on another group of people. So one of the outcomes of the plague was that it shook up the medical profession and got them more interested in trying to figure out what exactly was going on with particular diseases. There was now a focus on trying to learn what was causing disease so that effective treatments could be undertaken. And another change that up until this time, hospitals were essentially places to quarantine the sick until they either survived or died. After this time, we start to see people actually beginning to treat sick people to try and help them. So the medical profession was profoundly influenced by this particular plague.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of the interesting features of Plague Year is that the narrator is familiar with various medical theories concerning not only the transmission of the disease, but how to treat it. And that becomes part of his ruminations on what he's experiencing. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you so much for attending, and thank you, Terry, for sharing. I feel like we're kind of a disease team.
Tag team, yeah.
That's right.